Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to session 4 and day 2 of the 2021 Big Data Forum. My name is Mark Thomas. I'll be the moderator for this session. The session today, the title is The Road to AI for Social Good. I think we all know what AI is by now, is artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence for the social good. And this afternoon, we'll have a keynote presentation by Cristina Pombo Rivera. Ms. Pombo Rivera is the principal advisor and head of the digital and data cluster for the social sector at the Inter-American Development Bank. It's quite a mouthful, Cristina. Right. She's also a member of the OECD network of experts on AI and has lectured on digital transformation and of governments and data ethics at Harvard and the University of Michigan. She's an economist working at the intersection between social policy and technology and advises the IDB on its digital transformation strategies in areas such as education, health, social protection, labor markets, gender diversity, and migration. She also spearheads initiatives that leverage digital technologies to improve social services, including Latin America's first public-private alliance for the responsible use of artificial intelligence. After Cristina presents, we'll then have a panel discussion, and we have two eminent panelists joining Cristina. We weren't supposed to have Deodat Miraj, the Executive Director of the Caribbean Export Development Agency, but Deodat is regrettably ill. So we have the next best thing. We have Markson Gill, also from the Caribbean Export Development Agency. He is their advisor on competitiveness and export promotion. Thank you for joining us, Markson, at such late notice. Really appreciate it. And we're also being joined by Gayan Peiris. He is the head of data and technology in the Chief Digital Office of the United Nations Development Program in New York. Thank you, Mr. Peiris. Mr. Peiris leads the implementation of the UNDP's data strategy. He also led data and digital aspects of the UN's SDG action campaign. And for those of you who don't know, the SDGs, of course, are the Sustainable Development Goals. And he was the digital strategist on the UN Global Campaign to collect people's voices to shape the 2030 agenda, which of course led to the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you, Mr. Peiris, Mr. Gill, and of course, Ms. Pombo Rivera. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Ms. Pombo Rivera to give us our keynote address. Cristina.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. I'm gonna share my screen. So please let me know if everything's okay.
Yes,
and you are seeing, perfect. You are seeing in presentation mode, perfect.
Yes.
So hello all, it's a pleasure to be here. My job, as Mr. Thomas said, at the IDB is to work with Latin American and the Caribbean governments to promote the use and adoption of responsible AI. And while I quickly fell in love with the world of AI and the social impact, the social good this tech can do, a lot of research also found that the old saying, all that glitters is not gold, holds true, especially when it comes to bias and ethical challenges. This is also true for issues of gender equality and AI. And the more I see what is happening into the public policy area, the more obvious is to me that the bias can start anywhere in the system. And more often, it starts even before the data is collected. One learns that there is a historical practice of using data from men for fitting systems that serve women, that the design of many algorithms ignores the sex and gender dimension and its contribution in, for example, health decisions and diseases differentiation among individuals, or that recruitment software built on insufficient data favors some male CVs over female CVs. All these facts set alarm bells ringing in my head. And there is also bias in the way AI connects gender stereotypes from the world of work. Harvard Business Review cites word embeddings as a bias aspect of AI, like a game of word association. The systems can often associate man with engineer and women with nurse. This don't reflect modern society, or at least how we want modern society to progress. These are outdated views. It's quite troubling that the systemic injustices and inequalities we've been fighting against for so many years has made its way into technology in ways we may not be able to control. The problem has its roots in issues that surpass technology. Beyond the data, there are still several challenges when we set out to build and adopt AI fully ethical algorithms to ensure gender equality. First, depending on the method in which the algorithm was built, for example, supervised versus unsupervised learning, the algorithm could come up with outputs that are unexplainable by the organization that developed it or the world at large. It is not just the data then, the model matters. Second, there is an incorrect ground truth. That is, the algorithm was programmed with flaws. These data sets are labeled by humans, which sometimes have incorrect labels. And as humans have inherited biases, these biases often creep their way into the technologies we build. And the third challenge when it comes to ethical AI is building trust. As Mr. Thomas said, I am part of a network of experts led by the OECD, working on a framework for trustworthy AI that could guide the ethical development and use of this widely applicable technology. AI has been called the oxygen of tech, and we've seen in some of the others presentations during these 2 days, because it is present in virtually all the devices we interact with, from phones and audio speakers to cars and thermostats. It also has incredible potential to transform our lives in fields such as healthcare. In the future, we hope AI could power new medical diagnostic techniques, which potentially allow skilled medical practitioners to offer more accurate diagnosis, earlier interventions, and better patient outcomes. It is crucially important that we develop these systems in ethical and responsible ways, so that the biases of today are not baked into the technologies of tomorrow. And more important, we must first improve the culture to overcome the most pressing challenges and take advantages of the benefits of AI related to gender equality. What role, if any, should policymakers play in ensuring that AI does not perpetuate those biases? To overcome the built-in gender and diversity biases found in AI devices, data sets and algorithms take explicit actions. Policymakers need to think and set up the conditions to improve the global representation of women and diverse groups in technical roles and in boardrooms in the technology sector. There are several gaps when we talk about digitalization of welfare systems. Some of them are in digital access or in ownership of digital devices, in digital fluency, and there is even a gap in the capacity to make meaningful use of the access to technology. Many argue that one promising way of ensuring that historical bias does not get amplified and projected into the future is to increase the diversity of participants through the number of women in tech, for example. Only 22% of AI professionals globally are female, according to the World Economic Forum. Policymakers need to have courage and be encouraged to ask questions about how the technology is made and used, and then create robust and gender and diversity inclusive AI principle, guidelines, and code of ethics, and ensure their correct implementation. To do so, at the IDP, we emphasize the value of risk assessment and AI lifecycle approaches. This approach facilitates the connection with the public policy cycle. We have learned from working with different governments in different sectors that the lifecycle approach helps us think of AI technology as a tool, one out of 100 possibilities to address multiple social problems. It helps us to put the problem, the needs, the human being in the center, avoiding a techno-solutionism approach. This has also helped us to organize the discussion and to identify a specific risk associated with each stage of the AI lifecycle. For us, this helps to simplify a conversation that is not simple, but needs to be comprehensive. Fairness and bias issues with AI will require substantial efforts to address them. Some steps are clear. First, companies and governments using AI should disclose where AI systems are used and for what purpose. Second, AI engineers should be trained with a set of standard principles, like an adapted physician's Hippocratic oath. Engineers need to understand that their professions embeds ethical choices into products that make life-changing decisions, and thus promise to protect users' rights. Third, rigorous testing should be required and embedded in AI training tools to provide warnings or disallow use of models trained on data with unfair demographic coverage. And fourth, new laws requiring AI audits could be passed. If a company receives enough complaints, it could be AI audited for fairness, disclosure, and privacy protection, the same way it might face a tax audit if its books look fishy. All new technologies have had risks and downsides. History suggested that with time, many of the early errors of a new technology will be fixed and improved upon. We are confident that there will be technology and policy solutions to address the challenges of AI's influence, bias, and opaque operations. But first, we must inform people about the gravity of problems and then to mobilize them to work towards a solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Pombo Rivera, for that really insightful presentation. I know I have several questions, but we will now go to the panelists. So I know that yesterday we had presentations from the government and we had presentations from the private sector. Oops, my video is off, I'm being rude. Yes, so now we're in the development community sort of sphere. And to kick things off, I would like the panelists, and probably we start with Mr. Peiris first, since he's an integral part of the development community, to like give a sort of perspective on how prepared the development community within this neck of the woods, this part of the world, is to deal with these issues. Over to you, Mr. Peiris.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Let me, well, first of all, thank you for having me in the panel. It's a pleasure to be in the panel, and thank you, Ms. Rivera, for that very insightful and very practical presentation as well. Now, to answer your question, is the development community, specifically the UN, is the UN on par? Well, not yet. The UN Secretary General has rightly made this a top priority from day one. In his recent report, Our Common Agenda, he sets out a powerful vision for the UN as a source of data, analysis, and also foresight. But he also recognizes that we need to be humble in our approach. There is so much we need to learn from many stakeholders, and for many stakeholders, we are not an obvious partner on these issues with good reasons as well. So the UN Secretary General's data strategy challenges everyone in the UN family, in the development community, to use data to understand what happened, why it happened, and also what may happen next, and respond with insight, impact, and integrity. It guides all UN agencies to have 4 key ingredients for success: people and culture, governance, partnerships, and also partnerships with private sector as well, and technology. there are already many positive examples of how UN and the development system has harnessed data and technology in the past. Indeed, I'm privileged to have worked on a number of them, including the ones that you mentioned, the game-changing My World survey, which shaped the Sustainable Development Goals, and also the most recent UN 75 global crowdsourcing exercise, where we worked a lot with big data and with private sector in getting that data as well. So we have also supported some capacity building and technology exercises, such as the Technology Bank for the LDCs. But our track record has been uneven across the UN system and within the UN entities as well. So often waxing and waning with particular projects and in silos. So let me talk about our approach at UNDP, where I work. So at UNDP, we are keenly aware that the importance of big data. Data has always been central to our offer to the governments and our assistance to people we serve. And the statistics we have collected through flagship initiatives, such as the Human Development Report, have changed the way we look at the world, how we measure progress, and how we include in, who to include in those conversations. In my view, I think data should be a global public good, and the UN must continue to be the steward, especially in these times of contested information, misinformation. But data is much more than statistics. The fact that you just moved is recorded in your smartwatch or smartphone. It's all around us. It's in our social feeds, captured on phones, in satellites, automatically stored on servers across the world. And we are only really beginning to wake to this fact. The data held by Google, Amazon, and Microsoft and Facebook is said to be around 1,200 petabytes today. But by 2025, it's thought to be around 463,000 petabytes per day. So the growth of data is not linear, it is exponential. So how, in the development system, specifically in UNDP, how do we harness value from this data? Now, earlier this year, we adopted a data strategy based on the fundamental premise that better use of data is no longer optional. It is an organizational imperative if we are to respond effectively to crises like COVID, to deliver SDGs, and to remain a trusted partner for governments. That means recognizing that data is not a niche issue anymore. It's not confined to specialists. It's not confined to economists and the policymakers. From crisis response to programming to human resources to procurement, everyone needs to understand that we are data people. We need to understand how data and technologies impact our work and how can we harness these big data, the tools, to affect our impact on the ground as well as our own operations. This means investing in human capital and infrastructure, because this is a culture change, ensuring we ourselves have robust data governance frameworks and guide rails for these new technologies, but also having the space, the agility, and the culture to explore, to take calculated risk, and to co-create solutions with partners. Once again, I would highlight the word partners because I feel that is the way to move forward. And that's why our approach has been iterative, learning by doing. And this can push people out of their comfort zones, but it's a great way to ensure that whatever we are doing is grounded in practical realities and to position ourselves in the front line of innovation. Over the past year, we've changed our programs and results to be digital by default. What that means is we will ensure we use big data. We will ensure we produce data in our projects and programs. We have turbocharged a number of projects in country offices, in HQ, and in regional centers to support longer lasting change and like on the ground and in terms of how we work as well. And the major shift I have seen is UN, the development system, earlier used to be a consumer of data for the reports that we produce, for the blogs that we do, for the policies that we make. But now we are becoming providers of data as well with the projects and programmings we are doing on the ground, the unparalleled access we have on the ground, and also with the socioeconomic impact assessments, surveys we are doing on the ground, and staying true to our data principles, making data open by default. We are already making this data open, not just to the UN system, but to general public as well. on our data platform, Data Futures platform, and data.undp.org. So to close, I would say data is an open public good. Let's share it. Oh, back to you, Mr. Thomas.
Yes. So I'm getting a theme from yesterday's presentation, continuing into this one, that there is a view now that data is part of like what was defined as the commons, that it's now it's like air or water, that people have rights to it. Maybe I toss it back to Cristina before I go to Mr. Gill just briefly, because what are the implications of that from, should like data protections be enshrined in our constitution now, especially since, you know, it has such huge implications for us as societies going forward?
Definitely, I think so. I mean, good data, it's very important. And it's not only having data, it's having good data. There's a difference there. Garbage in, garbage out. Bias in, bias out. The idea behind using emerging technologies and big data is that more decisions will be better informed and based on data. And everyone here knows that the quality of data determines the quality of the results. When talking about inclusion, it is more critical. I already mentioned the gender bias discussion. Now we can think about the geographical location or other biases, which might be another barrier for an inclusive AI. So yes, data protection laws and the civil society getting to know what is happening and being empowered to ask the right questions is very, very important. It's not only accepting whatever the technology is saying, it's asking, why do you need the data for? What is the purpose of this data? And being like being really careful with what the data are you given to.
Thank you so much. So I'll go across to Mr. Gill now, because Mr. Gill, I think he has like feet in both worlds, from the private sector, and you know, he works for like a CARICOM organization where like obviously like the betterment of the region is like core to their functions. So Mr. Gill, I suppose following on from what we've heard from Cristina and from Gayan, that these things are going to be fundamental to the region's progress going forward. Where do you, from a person that has, you know, a footprint in the development sector and the economic growth sector, where do you see the region, and what would be the challenges and probably the opportunities going forward?
Thank you very much, Mark. And let me first say thank you for having me on. So I generally prefer to speak about opportunities rather than challenges for the most part. I do think there are a whole range of different areas that need to be taken into consideration and capitalized on as opportunities, while at the same point in time managing some risk. So I think one of the things that needs to be done in the region is that we have to take careful stock of the relationship between critical infrastructure services, as well as you know, the applications of artificial intelligence. So for example, when we look at the intersection between ICT, telecommunications infrastructure, and energy, for example, we do know that AI is turning up all different kinds of possibilities with regard to new energy services, the demand side management, the ability to integrate distributed renewables through microgrids, etc. But at the same point in time, in terms of managing risk, there's a bit of possibly an inherent contradiction, because you know, greater ICT use itself comes with an energy cost. So you have to be careful that as you seek low carbon energy transition, that you also manage the energy intensity as well that's created as a result. I think there's also going to be a need for consideration of the relationship between AI and big data analytics and its impact on labor markets as well. Certainly, there's no question that the application of those technologies can create new jobs, and we're likely going to see the growth of new industries such as cybersecurity, etc. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that it could also lead to technological unemployment as well in some areas. And we do know that even within, some white collar professions such as legal and accounting professions, some functions such as research and clerical functions are pretty much being overrun by AI, and those things used to be occupied by persons, right? So that's something that needs to be managed as well. But there's an opportunity there. A key risk we need to manage as well, I think, as this technology evolves, is that we don't exacerbate the digital divide. So of course, this is going to mean ensuring that there's a high penetration level of telecommunications infrastructure, and also ensuring that market structures themselves create affordable access to high quality services is going to be very, very important. And, from my side, where we care very, very much about small and medium-sized enterprises, this is going to be very, very important for them being able to digitalize functions within their businesses, to be able to benefit from services such as cloud computing, leverage e-commerce and engage in business model innovation as well. I think there's also a need to focus very carefully on overall innovation systems and ensuring that we create linkages between the science system and the private sector as well. This might mean supporting universities beyond just their teaching functions. It might mean funding public laboratories to do applied research, especially in areas where the private sector is unwilling or unable to do that kind of research. And I'd like to use agriculture as an example here because of the importance of food security to the region, especially in the current time where there's been some global supply chain disruptions that could not have been anticipated as well, combined with climate change effects, droughts, heat exchanges, etc. So there's a massive opportunity to leverage AI in applying precision agriculture techniques, which would allow farmers to increase production and be more efficient with their resource use. And I also want to say that there's also a massive opportunity as well for the use of controlled environment agriculture and the ability to use AI and big data analytics to develop new food varieties which can satisfy tastes and meet increasing demands for sustainably produced food on international markets as well. I could go on and on with this, but the last thing I will say here is that I think we also need to focus on making sure we utilize existing trade agreements as well to support the private sector in forming strategic alliances and undertaking joint ventures that's going to be able to facilitate that kind of technology transfer. So I'll leave it at that for now.
I have a question in the question and answer room. And by the way, people who are part of the audience, if you want to send a question, there's a little Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So please, if you haven't if you have noticed it already, please send the questions there. So the question that we have deals with social media, right? And should there be strict and enforceable code for social media platforms? And it's sort of a sidebar question to that is, I think it's Gayan that mentioned that, when I move, my phone keeps track of me. Chances are that's probably Google or Apple or, something like that. And how dependent the region will be on these giant multinational companies for a region that is sometimes views itself as fiercely independent. Would we be losing some of that when we are reliant on these large companies, the social media companies and these other companies? And I'll throw that out to the floor. Anyone that wants to take it, please.
So I can share some thoughts. And let's see, I'm open to the discussion, but I think from the side of the policymakers in which I'm, the realm in which I am, we need to start thinking regulation in a different way. The platforms are a completely different animal, and it's moving faster than the regulation. So we need to stop and think really, really careful what we need to do with that regulation. It's not we cannot use the excuse of we all need these social platforms to live. That's not an excuse. We need to start thinking about what we need to do. I think we have different approaches. We have the European approach with the GDPR that is much more stricter than other approaches. We have, of course, the China approach, which is this is what it is, and it's nothing is hidden. It's like this is what it is, and this is the world you live in. So we need to start thinking more thoughtfully on what we need to do and how to do it. I think we have let the conversation pass without giving much of a thought about it. And I think it's because we are used to listen to that sentence of data is the oil of the world. I'm not sure I agree with that sentence. And if I agree with that, we should be careful, because when you spill oil, you have a lot of difficulties. It's exactly the same, right? So protecting the data, and with digitalization, you can see the collection of the data like in asteroids. But what to do with that data, and then the disposal of the data? How are you going to do the disposal of the data? What happens if you are not using my data? It is going to be stored somewhere forever and ever? Those kind of questions we need to address and look into the eyes of the persons to start answering. I know this is not a straight answer. Maybe it's my economics deformation of being answering depend on and depend that, but there's interesting times, and we need to think regulation in a different way. I don't know if Mr. Peiris or Mr. Gill had another view on this.
But I just wanted to follow up with something you touched on there, because of course it opens the sort of sphere to being who controls my data, like my health data is controlled or is available to somebody, and I don't even know about it. My watch is collecting health information on me that could potentially show that I have a health issue that would deprive me of getting health insurance. All right. And that is in the hands of somebody. So the insurance company might be able to buy that data from Apple, who collects it from my Apple Watch, and they would deprive me of getting health insurance. So how do we deal with issues like that? And I'm directed to, anybody.
Yeah, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. In fact, I want to touch on what you said as well. Data is not the new oil, it is the new plutonium, because it can be extremely powerful. If mishandled, it can be extremely dangerous as well. And this is why I think the UN provides a human rights framework to work with data, to take the do no harm approach, especially when it comes. Also, people are getting more and more aware, and we need to increase the awareness as well of what your data means. In most people's minds, it is about protecting my passwords or my banking information. It is not. Your data is used in a totally different way these days. Your behavior is being tracked, and people are making money out of this. So I think raising awareness is a big part of this as well, Mr. Thomas. Raising awareness that everything that you have, your phone is not just for taking a call anymore. It is about your phone can actually. Your phone knows a lot about you. So on how you manage your personal data is extremely important as well.
Yes, thank you.
But I do think, Mr. Thomas, and sorry if I go back again, but I do think that I think it is important it's not only the data, but how the data is being used and what purpose. We as citizens should be asking that to companies and to governments as well. And we should be demanding, as I said, testing and all these things that are using the data. What is happening? And maybe, as I said, this allows some of the models that are trained in data that is not well collected, and the audits is very important. So I think yes, we must inform people about the gravity or the challenges, as Mr. Gill said, but then mobilize them to work towards a solution. I think the solutions are in the hands of, in our hands. So it's important not to say, no, this is very bad, and but so be it. No, I think there's things to do. And I just want to put in the chat, if I may, a book I just read that is really interesting. It's a storytelling, but it's science and storytelling. And so there are 10 stories about the use of data in the future. And it has the explanation of the technology, but also the ethical questions and the moral questions we can be asked. So yes, that's it. I just put it in the for the panelists, and then thank you. Someone put it to everyone.
Yeah. So I just want to remind people in the chat that you should copy that URL, because once this meeting comes down, that link may disappear. So please just copy the link so that you'd have it for future reference. I in fact, I'm going to do that right now. I wanted to go to Mr. Gill because, of course, we're talking about economic opportunity for the region. And I think there was a pathway, if you were at the lower rungs of sort of the economics scale, you would view a path through education to get to a particular level of economic empowerment. In the past, it seems from what we're saying now is that another dimension has been added to that climbing that ladder, where being educated or improving your educational status alone is insufficient. And that now you would have to have access to this data and the means by which you can analyze and draw conclusions from the data, right? And this is not just for whole of society things, but from an individual perspective. Mm-hmm. And what do you see? I know you prefer not to think of challenges, right? But what are the opportunities that's within this region to circumvent that problem?
Okay, so before I go on to that, I want to build on the previous conversation, because I think my response is going to link back into your question. And I just want to echo a bit of what Cristina was saying with regard to regulation, especially because I think this presents a classic, issue between the structure of, oligopolistic markets and the need to ensure you protect consumers, right? So I think anybody looking across the landscape would probably agree that there's probably been a bit of a consolidation of ownership and power across a lot of these platforms. So that obviously is as well going to create an information asymmetry between those firms as well as regulators. So I think it's going to be very, very important to enhance the capacity of regulators to do what it is our regulators are supposed to do. That said, I also want to say that we can't overlook the fact that there's a massive opportunity for small, medium-sized enterprises to leverage these platforms, because it gives them massive economies of scale with regard to the ability to market products, leverage e-commerce, etc. So, we can't throw the baby with the bathwater, I don't think. And that brings me to my response to your question, though. The second question, which has a lot to do with market intelligence. And I want to target market intelligence very, very specifically, because it's something we're very big on here as well at Caribbean Export. And I use this as an example as a way in which data can be used to help, solve some of the economic problems, because market intelligence is extremely important to SMEs. And by extension, economic development. And that link between the SME and economic development, of course, is very clear, because we know that in the region, SMEs account for up to about 85% of enterprises, about 60 to 70% of gross domestic product, and about 50% of overall employment. So very, very important what's happening with SMEs. And while the market intelligence problem is not a new problem, it's a difficult problem to solve. Most SMEs lack access to actionable market intelligence. They also lack the ability generally to analyze big data sets, make decisions on market trends, product development, and emerging niches. And even the ability to identify market access requirements can be a challenge as well. So it would seem to me that an emphasis on predictive analytics is going to be really, really important for the growth of SMEs within the current global economic context. And I think that there's a big opportunity for us at trade promotion organizations like Caribbean Export to be able to leverage artificial intelligence, to be able to provide market intelligence services as a public good. Some platforms exist and they're very useful. However, capabilities can always be improved. But it reminds me of the concept of blue ocean strategic thinking. What new services can we introduce to be able to benefit SMEs to deliver something that they previously have not been privy to? How can that lead to transformation in their production efficiency, their ability to create new markets, create new products, etc. So I do want to focus on market intelligence here as a very, very specific, pointed area to touch to your question.
Can I just ask Mr. Gill about, I know you mentioned like SMEs, but like, there is a significant amount of businesses in the Caribbean that are like they're micro, not, they're not even able to like get to like the level of small, but how do you perceive it for them? Because I think from a social protection sort of perspective, there's so many jobs that are like 1 or 2 person enterprises in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, and where do you see them fitting in? Because if you need to have a sort of minimum level of capacity to handle the opportunities that data present, are they going to be left behind, and therefore will we be creating some sort of social problems there?
That's a fantastic observation from my point of view. I mean, earlier I did speak about being careful to make sure we don't exacerbate the digital divide. And this is, going around back to that particular point that was made. I also want to note that where the micro firms are concerned, it does point to an issue which Cristina raised in her presentation with regard to social inclusion. The fact of the matter is that a lot of micro enterprises are owned and operated by vulnerable populations such as, youth, women, etc. So to leave micro enterprises out of the equation would be a very, very big mistake for our societies. Yeah. So with that said, I think the answer to this, again, is to ensure, one, access to critical infrastructure services, ensuring a very high level of penetration. Throughout the region, we would know that all countries are not the same. They don't have the same level of critical infrastructure penetration, and that has an impact on who has access to what. So that's a very, very important part of it. But in addition, I do think the onus is on organizations like Caribbean Export and other organizations to make sure that when we do this work, that it functions as a public good that is accessible to everyone. It might mean that for our organizations, we need to come up with new business models to try to understand how that's going to work for us. But I do think that needs to be the approach.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask Mr. Peiris now, because you have experience with a sort of public project where you collect the opinions from the project, from the public, either via questionnaires or via big data, and then applying that in very sort of specific development contexts by developing plans and strategies for addressing development challenges. And I'd like to ask you for some, in an ideal path going forward, how would you chart that path for a country like Trinidad and Tobago? Where, given your knowledge of where we are now, how can you foresee us going forward and making the maximum use of these opportunities that this technology presents?
Thank you, Mr. Thomas, for that question. I think, first of all, I would like to emphasize that big data and AI are just a tool. They are not solutions. they are only as good as the humans that deploy it and the data that, on which it is biased and the standards that govern it and the programs that they support it. So from my experience, specifically collecting data from people and using it in different frameworks, one of the key things is to first of all ensure that we have the human rights, dignity, security, and privacy at the core of everything that we do. And that cannot be an afterthought after we collect the data. In all of the data collection exercises I've been in, that was thought, like how the data is used, just like I think Cristina said, how the data is used, how the data will be destroyed after we finish our initiative. And also, when we collect data from users, do we tell the users exactly what we are collecting data for? Right? And do they know how their data is being used? Now, this was taught at the beginning. So it's sort of thinking through that governance framework, the human rights framework is the key. So I think this is a transformation that needs to happen at all levels, not just at the government level. It is to have, because with big data, it is not just the government collecting the data. It is not just a local municipality collecting the data. It is the private sector. It is maybe some private companies that are collecting data. So there needs to be at a country level, there needs to be several layers of things happening. One is obviously on the frameworks, on the governance frameworks that Cristina talked about. And she gave some practical examples of how even some of these can be audited. And it is the same for the governments as well, to be audited on the use of big data, on the use of AI, on the use of collection data that you collected through people. And also have a very practical approach on how you change the way that you look at national statistical officers, how you collect statistics for your decision making, and you make use of this data and have a plan on how to do that as well. Having the proper structures in place, building capacity of these institutions that use data to make policies, to make decisions. So having that, and also a big part of that is what Mr. Gill touched on the infrastructure side of things as well. The development of infrastructure to make use of that data, and which lays a clear pathway on 3 pillars, basically on the governance, on people, and also on the technology and infrastructure moving forward.
Sorry, I just wanted to go back to Cristina now, because of following up on something that you said. Of course, a big part of the UN agenda is the Leave No One Behind agenda. And I think we're in a region where there are significant portions of the populations that are outside of the sort of digital net. I think we saw this with COVID-19, where 60,000 out of a population of 250,000 students in Trinidad and Tobago did not have digital devices to access online education, right? So we, using that as a sort of metric, if you have this significant portion of the population that are either outside of the digital divide, or only partially dipping their toe into the digital world, how can we ensure that we move them into inclusion, and that they are not, we don't create another dimension of inequality where we have the digitally unequal or digitally unempowered? Cristina.
I think that's a very important question, and it touches a lot of different areas. So the society as a whole should be thinking about it. There's not one bullet for it. I mean, there's no one solution for this. I think, and when I say the society as a whole, I'm thinking Mr. Thomas and universities or in schools thinking about the digital skills? How do you start? Because as I said, the gaps are not only in the access of the devices or in the connectivity, it's also in how people know how to use the devices. I was reading the other day a very interesting conversation in Twitter, in fact, about the two-factor authentication for older people. Apparently, older people with not smartphones are not able to, or not being able to connect to some of the web pages or services that requires two-factor authentication. Is anybody thinking about that? Is anybody thinking not only in the rural population, but in the older population? Think, for example, the Aadhaar digital identity system in India. There's a lot of peasants with no fingerprints because of the manual work. So they are not being able to access to the subsidies of the government because they cannot show that they are they. So all these situations are very important to address. And I think the answer, maybe my answer to your question would be try to find a comprehensive action plan to address all those issues. It's the digital divide. It's not only connectivity, it's the last mile connectivity. It's not, you can have 100% connectivity to your community, but then what happened inside the school or inside the hospital? Are they connected as well? Or interoperability. There's a lot of barriers with interoperability. Are you talking the same language with other systems? So to tackle this problem and to avoid widening the inequalities, I think we should thinking as a whole, as a society. And that would be my provocation here.
And I'll open up, I think this might be the last question. Okay, I see there's one more question from the chat room, and then if we have time, I'll ask mine. What about a policy that resolves, okay, I think it might be the word revolves. What about policy that revolves around the quality of technology being offered to those digitally divided? So sort of, it's not just the quantity, but the quality of the technology that people have access to. That some persons might be able to have access not to better information than other people. Not up to anyone.
Yeah, if I may just jump in to say that what that question makes me reflect on, and what I was also reflecting on when Cristina was speaking, is the fact that when we talk about digital divide, as far as I can tell, the digital divide pretty much reflects already pre-existing inequalities. So, to have this conversation, speaking about access to technology is fine, but we have to have the conversation within the broader context of the problems that have existed for a very, very long time, which are baked into the structure of our societies. Problems with regard to overall absolute poverty, problems with regard to widening gap of wealth inequality within society, problems relating to gender inequalities. So we cannot address that digital divide issue unless we do so in conjunction with resolving those other issues. And that is at the heart of even addressing something such as quality, access to quality technologies, which was just asked about.
I think we can go on quite a long time with these discussions. I think what I'll just do, since Cristina started, what I will do, I'll just ask each of you all to give like a final closing statement before we sign off. Cristina.
So, okay. So I think that my final reflection on this would be to think about the unintended consequences that are hard to prevent. And more than a specific analytical technique, we should be thinking about the development of these technologies and the use of data with a social good perspective. It's have intentionality in the use of data and intentionality in the use of technical devices.
And finally, in fact, I might just give Mr. Peiris the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas, and thank you, rest of the panelists as well. I would like to close out with bringing up the importance of partnerships in this, and there's no way that the development system or UN can work alone in this, and partnerships with the private sector, bringing everyone to the table, and the data trusts, each one contributing to the data ecosystem is I think, the way forward if we are to overcome these challenges. And we will continue to work with stakeholders to achieve fair and sustainable digital transformation. And so I think international cooperation, ethics and governance of technologies, AI and big data is important. And I believe we can harness our collective intelligence on a larger scale than ever before. And thank you once again for having me.
So I just wanted to thank the panelists for today's session. I know we could go on for a while, but I just wanted to tease the next session, which is starting in about 5 minutes time, which deals with robotic bees. So I think everybody might be interested in that one going forward. I thank everybody for participating, all the people who were part of our audience, and I hope you gained something from today's session. Thank you very much. Goodbye.